Kethvoron had lived for 400 years, and in all that time he had never once felt his hands shake. He stood on the landing platform of Oreth 4, with his armored body towering over the humans, who moved around him like small, busy creatures, unaware of the giant in their midst. He watched them with the same mild curiosity one might give to insects building a nest. The Galactic Coalition had assigned him here as an observer liaison to the 907th Human Expeditionary Company, and he considered this the greatest insult of his long career. The Dralith were the finest warriors the galaxy had ever produced, and everyone knew this, and everyone accepted this the way they accepted that stars burned, and that space was cold, and that some truths simply did not require debate. His people stood 8 feet tall, with natural armor plating across their bodies, and 4 arms that could each crush steel, and compound eyes that could track a particle round in mid-flight. Fought in 9 galactic wars without ever knowing defeat. And now the Coalition had sent him to babysit humans. He had read the briefing files on the transport ship, and had found them almost amusing in how little they contained. Humans were a young species, barely 300 years into spaceflight, with soft bodies that broke easily and short lives that ended quickly, and a homeworld so fragile that they had nearly destroyed it themselves before they even left it. They had no natural armor, and no claws, and no venom, and no ability to regenerate lost limbs, and their senses were dull compared to almost every other species in the Coalition. And yet somehow they had been granted a seat at the war table, alongside the Dralith, and the Torvan, and the Melisari, and all the other species who had earned their place through millennia of proven strength. Kethvoron found this puzzling, but not worth worrying about. The war was what mattered. Terrible. The Vryn Collective had been consuming star systems for decades now, and their hive-mind intelligence spread like a disease across every world it touched, turning cities into organic nests and people into raw biological material, and leaving nothing behind but silence and the smell of acid. The Coalition had formed to stop them, and every species had contributed forces, and now they were preparing for the next phase of what the humans had named the Harrowing. Kethvoron walked across the base toward the 907th barracks, and he noticed how the humans moved out of his way when they saw him coming, and how their eyes went wide, and how some of them whispered to each other. He was used to this. Every species looked at the Dralith with awe, and the humans were no different. He found the company commander in a small office that smelled like bitter liquid the humans called coffee, and she looked up at him without standing, and without any expression of awe or intimidation at all. "You must be my new shadow," she said. Her name was Captain Lena Vasquez, and she was small even by human standards, with dark hair pulled back tight, and lines around her eyes that suggested she had not slept well in a very long time, and a voice that carried the kind of quiet authority that did not need volume. "I am Observer Liaison Kethvoron of the 3rd Dralith War Chapter," he said, and he made sure his tone conveyed exactly how far beneath him this assignment was. "Great," Vasquez said, and she took a sip of her coffee, and looked at him the way someone might look at a piece of furniture they had not ordered, but would have to find room for anyway. He did not like her immediately. Over the next several days he observed the 907th, as they conducted combat drills and readiness exercises, and he documented everything with the precision his people were known for. The humans were fast, and he noted this with mild approval. Adapted to changing scenarios, quickly shifting tactics mid-exercise in ways that showed genuine creativity, and he noted this too. Their weapons were adequate, and their formations were sound, and their communication was efficient. But something else caught his attention, and he could not stop watching it once he noticed. They flinched. During live-fire exercises, the soldiers would duck and twist away from simulated explosions, even though they knew the blasts were not real, and their bodies would jerk at sudden sounds, and their breathing would change before combat drops, becoming rapid and shallow, and their hands would tremble as they checked their weapons. He watched one young soldier, a thin woman with red hair, grip her rifle so hard before a training drop that her knuckles turned white, and her jaw was clenched, and her eyes were too wide, and she looked like an animal about to bolt. And then the drop signal came, and she went anyway, repeated dozens of times, across dozens of soldiers, and he began to wonder if there was some kind of systemic malfunction in human biology that caused them to partially shut down before the very moments when they needed to be most alert. He raised this question with Vasquez during one of their briefings. "Your soldiers appear to malfunction before combat," he said. And he kept his voice neutral and clinical, because he was a scholar as well as a warrior, and he believed in precise observation. Their pupils dilate, and their hands shake, and their breathing becomes irregular, and several of them appear to experience mild paralysis before action, and I am curious whether this is a defect in their training or a flaw in their species that you have not yet evolved past. Vasquez set down her coffee. She looked at him for a long time, and there was something in her expression that he could not read, because human faces were complicated and messy, and full of tiny movements that conveyed meaning he had no framework to interpret. "That is called fear, Kefvoran," she said, and her voice was very even. "And no, it is not a defect." He tilted his head the way Drelith did when they encountered information that did not fit into existing categories. "Fear," he repeated. He knew the word, of course, but only as a concept that applied to lesser creatures, to prey animals, and to species that had not yet climbed to the top of their evolutionary ladder. The Drelith did not feel fear, and this was not a boast, but simply a biological fact, like saying they had 4 arms or compound eyes. Their brains did not produce the chemical signals that other species associated with terror and panic and dread. They walked into battle with perfect calm, and they fought with perfect calm, and they died with perfect calm. And this was what made them the greatest warriors in the galaxy. "I understand the concept," he told Vasquez, "but I confess, I do not understand why your species has not eliminated it through training or genetic modification, as it clearly impairs combat performance." Vasquez stared at him again with that unreadable expression. "Maybe one day you will understand," she said, and then she turned back to her work. He dismissed the conversation as unimportant. 3 days later, the orders came through, and the 907th was being deployed to Calyx 9, a colony world already half consumed by the Vryn, where 12,000 civilians were waiting for rescue in underground shelters, and where the Vryn had built a hive network so dense that orbital scans could not penetrate it. The briefing room was full, and Kefvoran stood at the back and watched the humans as the mission details were laid out in terrible clarity. The casualty projections were high, the enemy density was extreme, the extraction windows were narrow, and every single human in that room was afraid. He could see it in their eyes, all of them, in the way they sat too still or moved too much, in the way they swallowed hard or clenched their jaws or stared at nothing, and he could almost smell the chemical change in the air as their bodies flooded with the very thing Vasquez had called fear. And not one of them stood up and refused to go. Not one of them asked to be reassigned. Not one of them said a single word of protest. They were afraid, and they were going anyway, and Kefvoran watched this and felt something stir in a part of his mind he had never used before. He did not know what to call it. He dismissed it as curiosity. But that night he lay in his quarters and stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in 400 years of life, he could not sleep. Calyx 9 was a dying world, and it smelled like acid and rot, and something else that Kefvoran could not name, but that made even his hardened Drelith senses recoil. The surface was a nightmare of twisted structures that had once been buildings, but were now wrapped in the dark organic tissue of the Vryn hive network, and the sky was choked with yellow fog that burned the skin, and the ground was soft in places where the Vryn had burrowed so deep that the earth itself had begun to collapse. The 907th landed in the ruins of what had once been a city called New Valencia, and within the first hour of boots on the ground, Kethvorin understood why the casualty projections had been so high. The Vryn were everywhere. They came from below, and from the walls, and from the ceilings of ruined buildings, and they moved with the terrible coordination of a single mind, controlling 1,000,000 bodies, and their acid-tipped limbs could cut through standard coalition armor like it was. The first engagement happened before anyone was ready. A patrol of 12 humans and Kethvorin were moving through a collapsed commercial district when the ground split open, and Vryn drones poured out in a wave of clicking mandibles and glistening black bodies, and the sound they made was like 1,000 knives being dragged across stone. Kethvorin fought the way Drelith always fought. He moved forward with calm precision, and his forearms worked independently, and each one held a weapon, and he cut through the drones with the mechanical efficiency of a machine designed for exactly this purpose. And he did not flinch, and he did not hesitate, and he did not feel anything at all. The humans fought differently. They screamed, they shouted warnings to each other, and they cursed, and they yelled names, and they made sounds that had no tactical value whatsoever, and their faces were twisted with expressions that Kethvorin was learning to recognize as fear, terror, and rage, and desperation, all mixed together into something raw and primal. And they were effective. Not in the way he was effective, which was clean and precise and emotionless, but in a way that was wild and adaptable and unpredictable. A Drelith soldier fought like water flowing downhill, following the path of least resistance with perfect calm. A human soldier fought like a fire, spreading in every direction at once, burning through obstacles by sheer force of desperate will. He watched a private named Chen grab a fallen piece of metal and use it as a shield when her rifle jammed, and then pick up a dead drone's severed limb and use it as a weapon, and then find a gap in the swarm and push 3 other soldiers through it, while screaming at them to move, move, move. Her hands were shaking the entire time. Wide eyes and trembling bodies, and Kethvorin stood among them, untouched and unmoved, and he felt the distance between himself and these creatures like a canyon that he could see across but not cross. Over the next 2 weeks, the fighting was constant and brutal, and Kethvorin began to notice something that changed the way he understood everything. When a Drelith soldier advanced into danger, it was because advancing was what Drelith soldiers did, and there was no internal debate, and no moment of decision, and no act of will required, because the absence of fear meant the absence of any reason not to advance. It was automatic, like breathing. But when a human soldier advanced into danger, there was a moment, and he could see it now that he knew what to look for. There was a fraction of a second where their body said no, and their mind said yes, and something inside them made a choice, and the choice cost them something real and physical, and he could see that cost in the tension of their muscles and the set of their jaws, and the way their eyes went hard and bright. They were not simply doing what came naturally. They were overriding their own nature with every single step. And the one who taught him this most clearly was Corporal Ao Osei. Osei was the company medic, a young man from a country called Ghana, with gentle hands and a soft voice, and a laugh that could fill a room. And he was perhaps the most afraid person Kethvorin had ever observed. During the 3rd week, a squad was pinned down in a collapsed parking structure, and 2 soldiers were hit, and they were bleeding out in the open, with Vryn fire raining down from 3 directions, and anyone who moved into that open space was going to die, and everyone knew it. Kethvorin was positioned behind cover 20 meters away, and he watched as Osei crouched behind a wall, and he could see everything. He could see the medic's hands shaking so badly that he almost dropped his medical kit twice. He could see tears running down Osei's face, and not from any wound, but from pure overwhelming terror. He could see the young man's chest heaving, with breaths that were too fast and too shallow. And he could see the way Osei's legs were tensed, as if his body was physically trying to make him run in the opposite direction. And then Osei closed his eyes for 2 seconds, and he whispered something that Ketvaron's audio sensors picked up as a prayer in a language he did not know. And then Corporal Io Osei stood up and ran into the open. He ran with his medical kit in his shaking hands, and his tears still wet on his face, and Vryn fire scorching the ground around him. And he reached the first wounded soldier, and dropped to his knees, and his hands were still shaking, but they found the wound, and applied the seal and stopped the bleeding, with the precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. And dragged them back, and then he went out again for the second one. Kethvorin watched all of this, and something happened inside him that he had no name for. It was not admiration, because he had admired many warriors in his long life, and this felt different. It was not respect, because respect was something he gave to equals, and he had always considered himself above humans, and this felt like something that went in the other direction entirely. It was something that made him feel small, and he had never felt small before. 4 days later he received a report that a Draelith platoon attached to another sector of the Calyx 9 operation had been wiped out entirely. 48 Draelith warriors had advanced into a Vryn ambush with their usual perfect calm, and the ambush had closed around them, and they had continued fighting with their usual perfect calm, and they had been overwhelmed and killed to the last soldier with their usual perfect calm. Had not retreated, because the concept of retreat did not exist in the Draelith mind. They had not adapted, because their calm was not adaptability, but rigidity disguised as strength. They had walked into death with peace in their hearts, and death had taken them without difficulty. Kethvorin read the report and felt nothing, because that was how Draelith processed loss, and he set the datapad down and stared at the wall. Vasquez found him sitting like that an hour later, and she read the report over his shoulder, and she was quiet for a long time. They did not fall back, Kethvorin said, and he meant it as a statement of pride. I know, Vasquez said, and her voice was strange and sad and careful. They should have. Draelith do not retreat. I know that too, she said, and she sat down across from him, and her eyes were full of something complicated. Kethvorin, sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is run so they can fight tomorrow. Wanted to argue, but the words did not come, because he was thinking about 48 warriors who had marched calmly to their deaths, and he was thinking about Corporal Osei, who had been terrified and shaking and weeping, and who had run toward danger instead of away from it, and who was still alive. And he was thinking about the difference between those two things. The final lesson of this chapter came 3 days before the end of the first extraction phase, when the primary route to the civilian shelters began collapsing due to Vryn tunneling, and the entire operation was at risk. The tactically sound choice was to push forward through the collapse zone and accept heavy casualties. And this was what the Draelith commanders recommended, because it was the direct path, and directness was strength. Vasquez refused. She ordered the 907th to pull back and find an alternate route, and the Draelith officers called this cowardice on the command channel. Flush of agreement with them, because pulling back was weakness, and everyone knew this. But Vasquez did not care what everyone knew. She pulled her people back, and she found another way through the ruins, and it took 6 hours longer, and it was terrifying for every human involved, because they were moving through unexplored Vryn territory in the dark, with no support. And they got through, and they extracted 4,000 civilians without losing a single soldier. And the Draelith force that had pushed through the collapse zone lost 30% of their strength, and extracted no one, because the route had been a trap all along. That night, Kethvorin sat in his quarters, and for the first time in 400 years, he began to wonder if everything he had ever believed about strength was wrong. He did not yet have the answer, but the question alone felt like something breaking open inside him, and he did not know how to make it stop. Entirely sure he wanted to. The guns went quiet for 3 weeks, and in that silence, Kethforan learned more about humanity than he had in all the battles combined. The 907th was encamped in the ruins of a residential district on the outskirts of New Valencia, waiting for reinforcements and supplies and fresh orders. And the soldiers had nothing to do but exist. And it turned out that watching humans exist was far more disturbing to Kethforan than watching them fight. Because in battle, the fear had a direction and a purpose, and it burned hot and fast, and then it was over. But in the silence, the fear did not leave. It stayed. It lived inside them like a second heartbeat, and it came out at night in ways that made Kethforan sit in the darkness of his quarters and listen with a growing sense of something he could not name. Sergeant Tomás Reyes slept in the room next to his, and every night, without exception, Reyes woke up screaming. The screams were not the kind a soldier made in battle when they were wounded or surprised, but something deeper and more terrible, like the sound of a mind being torn apart from the inside. And Kethforan would hear the thrashing and the gasping, and sometimes the quiet sobbing that followed. And then he would hear Reyes get up and walk to the small basin in his room and splash water on his face. And every morning Reyes would emerge with his uniform straight and his boots laced and his voice steady, and he would lead his squad with the calm authority of a man who had everything under control. And no one spoke about the screaming. It took Kethforan several days to understand that everyone heard it, and everyone knew, and everyone simply accepted it as part of what it meant to be human in a war zone. He began watching more carefully during the daylight hours. He watched soldiers sit together in small groups and talk about things that had nothing to do with the war, like foods they missed and games they used to play, and people they loved back home. And sometimes they would laugh, and the laughter was real, even though it existed right next to the grief and the terror, like two rivers running side by side. He watched Private Chen sit alone behind a ruined wall and write letters on a small datapad. And when he asked her who she was writing to, she told him her brother, who was 12 years old and who wanted to be a pilot. And she wrote to him every day, even though the communications relay was down and the letters could not be sent yet. "Why write if they cannot be delivered?" Kethforan asked. Chen looked at him and smiled, and her smile was sad and tired and somehow still warm. And she said, "Because someday they will be, and I want him to know I thought about him every single day, even the bad ones." He watched two soldiers, whose names he never learned, sit on a pile of rubble at sunset, and hold hands, and not speak, and simply exist together in the fading light. And their faces were not happy or sad, but something in between that the Drelith language had no word for. He watched a soldier named Kowalski build a small memorial out of stones and scrap metal for the people they had lost, and he placed each piece with careful hands, and he spoke their names out loud one by one, as if saying a name could somehow keep a person from being truly gone. And he watched and watched and watched, and the more he watched, the more he began to understand that humans were not simply organisms that experienced fear as an occasional combat response. They were beings who lived inside fear every moment of every day. Fear of death, fear of loss, fear of pain, fear of being forgotten, fear of failing the people they loved, fear of the dark, fear of the silence, fear of the future, and fear of the past. Their entire existence was saturated with it, and they carried it the way they carried their bones, hidden inside them, always present, always heavy, real. And somehow they still laughed, and somehow they still wrote letters and held hands, and built memorials, and told jokes, and shared food and sang songs in the evening, that Kethvorin did not understand, but that made something ache in a part of him he had not known existed. The night that changed everything was quiet and warm, and the yellow fog had cleared enough to see the stars. Kethvorin found Vasquez sitting on the rooftop of a half-collapsed building, with her legs dangling over the edge, and her face tilted up toward the sky, and she looked smaller than he had ever seen her. He climbed up and sat beside her, because somewhere in the past weeks he had stopped thinking of her as a subject of observation and started thinking of her as something else, and he did not have a word for what that something else was. They sat in silence for a while, and then he asked, "Are you functioning properly, Captain?" She laughed, and the laugh was short and bitter. "Honest, P. No, Kethvorin," she said. "I am not functioning properly, and I have not been functioning properly since the day I shipped out, and I probably will not function properly ever again. P." He waited, because he had learned that humans often needed time to find the words for what they were feeling. "I have a daughter," Vasquez said, and her voice changed when she said this, becoming softer and more fragile, like something that could break if handled roughly. "Her name is Sophia, and she is 8 years old, and she has my eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she thinks I am a hero." She paused and swallowed hard. "I am not a hero," she said. "I am terrified every second of every day, and I mean that literally, Kethvorin. And I do not say it for dramatic effect, and I do not say it to be humble, and I say it because it is the truth." She looked at him, and her eyes were bright in the starlight. "I am terrified that I will die on this world, and my daughter will grow without me, up without a mother, and she will spend her whole life wondering if I thought about her at the end. And I am terrified that I will make a wrong call and get my people killed, and I will have to live with their faces for the rest of my life. And I am terrified of the Vryn, because they are horrible, beyond anything I was prepared for. And I am terrified of the dark, because the dark is when the memories come back. And I am terrified of the quiet, because in the quiet I can hear my own thoughts, and my thoughts are not kind to me." She took a breath that shuddered on the way in. "And tomorrow I will wake up and put on my uniform, and stand in front of my soldiers, and they will look at me and see someone who is not afraid. And I will lie to them with my face and my voice and my posture, because they need me to lie to them, and because that is what leadership is. And I will do this every day, until this war is over, or until I am dead." Kethvorin sat with those words, and they landed on him, with a weight that he felt in his actual body, as if gravity had increased. He thought about his own 400 years of life, and he thought about the battles he had fought, and the enemies he had killed, and the wars he had survived. And he realized with a shock that reverberated through his entire being, that in all those centuries he had never once experienced anything as powerful as what this small, fragile human woman carried inside her every single day. She was not just afraid of one thing, or two things, or even 10 things. She was afraid of everything, and she had been afraid of everything for as long as she could remember. And she would be afraid of everything until the day she died. And this was not a malfunction, and this was not a defect, and this was not weakness. This was the fundamental condition of being human. And she lived inside it, and she led inside it, and she loved inside it, and she fought inside it, and it never stopped, and it never got easier. She did it anyway. Kethvorin looked down at his own massive armored hands, and for the first time in his life, they felt inadequate. He had 4 arms that could crush steel, and he could not carry what she carried. He had natural armor that could deflect bullets, and he had no protection against what she faced every night when she closed her eyes. He had lived 4 centuries without fear, and he had never once done anything as brave as what Lena Vasquez did every single morning when she opened her eyes and chose to get out of bed. That night he returned to his quarters, and he did something that no Drelith had ever done in the recorded history of his species. He opened a blank file on his datapad, and he began to write. Not a report, and not a tactical assessment, and not an observation log, but something personal and raw and formless. And he wrote about what he had seen, and what he had heard, and what he was beginning to feel. And the words came out clumsy, strange, because the Drelith language was not built for this. He wrote for hours, and when he finished he sat back and looked at what he had created, and he realized that he had written the first Drelith journal entry in history. 3 days later, the reinforcements arrived, and with them came news that turned the blood cold in every human who heard it. The Vryn had deployed a Queen-class bioform on Calyx 9. A Queen was the heart of a hive network, and it was massive and intelligent and surrounded by thousands of elite drones, and no coalition force had ever killed one, and the mission was no longer a simple extraction. They were going to have to go underground and kill the Queen, or Calyx 9 would be lost entirely, along with every civilian still hiding in the shelters. Kethvorin stood in the briefing room and watched the 907th receive this news, and he saw the fear move through them like a wave. He saw hands clench, and jaws tighten, and eyes go wide. Heard the sharp intake of breath that came from 50 soldiers, realizing at the same moment that their chances of survival had just dropped to almost nothing. And then he watched them do what humans always did. They checked their weapons, and they checked each other, and they held each other close, and some of them prayed, and some of them wept, and some of them laughed, because laughter was apparently something humans did when nothing else would work. And then they formed up in perfect ranks, and they were ready. He went back to his quarters that night, and he opened his journal, and he wrote a single entry that would later become the most famous line in Drelith literature. I have lived 400 years without fear, and these creatures live perhaps 80, drenched in it. And yet they are the ones who inspire me, and I do not know what to do with this knowledge, except to carry it forward, and hope that it makes me worthy of standing beside them. He closed it, file, and sat in the darkness. And outside, he could hear Sergeant Reyes screaming in his sleep. And then he could hear the water splashing. And then he could hear the boots being laced. And in the morning, they would all go together into the dark. The tunnel entrance looked like a wound in the earth, and that was not a metaphor, but a literal description, because the Vryn had bored through the rock and lined the passage with living tissue that pulsed and glistened and breathed, and the air that came out of it was hot and wet and smelled like blood. Kethvorin stood at the edge of the opening and looked down into the darkness and felt nothing, because that was what Drelith felt when they looked into darkness. Nothing at all. But beside him, the humans of the 907th stood in their combat lines, and they felt everything. He could see it, and he could hear it, and after all these weeks, he could almost feel it radiating off them like heat from a fire. Their breathing was fast, and their pupils were wide, and their muscles were tight, and some of them were whispering to themselves, and some of them were gripping their weapons so hard that their gloves creaked. And Private Chen had her eyes closed, moving in what he now knew was a prayer. The assault plan was simple, in the way that desperate plans always are. 3 coalition forces would enter the hive network from 3 different directions and push toward the central chamber, where the Queen-class bioform had established herself. And whoever reached the chamber first would set demolition charges, while the others held the defensive perimeter. And then everyone would run. The Drelith contingent was entering from the north with their usual mechanical calm. A Torvan strike team was entering from the east with their characteristic silence. And the 907th was entering from the west through the wound in the earth, and they were entering screaming. Vasquez gave the order, and they dropped into the tunnel, and the darkness swallowed them, and the sounds that came from the human soldiers as they advanced were unlike anything the other species produced. They shouted, and they cursed, and they called each other's names, and they roared challenges at an enemy that could not understand language, and they made noise, because noise was how humans pushed back against the dark, because silence was where the fear grew loudest, And so they filled the silence with their voices and their rage and their refusal to go quietly. Kethvorin moved with them, and for the first time, he tried to see the battle the way they saw it. He tried to imagine what it would be like to move through this hellscape of pulsing walls and acid air and chittering unseen enemies while also fighting a war inside his own mind. He tried to imagine what it felt like to have every nerve in his body screaming at him to turn around and run, while he forced himself to keep walking forward into the dark. He could not imagine it fully, but the attempt alone was enough to stagger him. The Vryn hit them hard in the first junction. Drones poured from side tunnels in waves of black chitin and acid. Became a nightmare of close-quarters combat, where the walls were alive, and the floor was slick, and the enemy came from every direction. Kethvorin fought with his 4 arms, spinning a circle of death around himself, and his calm was absolute, and his efficiency was perfect, and he was a machine of war, operating at peak capacity. But the humans beside him were something else entirely. They were chaos and fire and desperate screaming will, and they adapted to every new threat in real time, not because they were calm, but because fear made them creative in ways that calm never could. When the drones changed tactics, the humans changed faster. When a tunnel collapsed, the humans found another way through before the dust had settled. When the ammunition ran low, a soldier named Park started using a broken drone limb as a club, and 2 others followed her lead within seconds, and they fought with improvised weapons and bloody hands, and tears streaming down their faces. They did not stop. They would not stop. Kethvorin had fought beside Dralith warriors for 4 centuries, and he had never seen anything like the terrible, beautiful fury of humans who were afraid and fighting anyway. They pushed deeper and deeper into the hive, and the resistance grew worse with every meter, and the casualties mounted, and Corporal Oze moved through the chaos like a ghost with his medical kit and his shaking hands, saving lives one desperate intervention at a time. And then they reached the central chamber, and everything went wrong. The chamber was vast and cathedral-like, with walls that pulsed with bioluminescent light, and the Queen was there in the center, and she was enormous and terrible, and she was not alone. The elite drones that surrounded her were twice the size of normal Vryn, and their armor was thick enough to shrug off standard weapons fire, and there were hundreds of them. And the moment the 907th entered the chamber, the Queen turned her massive head and looked at them with eyes that held a cold, alien intelligence. The demolition team needed 20 minutes to set the charges. Someone needed to hold the chamber entrance for 20 minutes against an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1. Vasquez turned to her soldiers, and she did not give a speech, because there was no time for speeches. She simply said, "I need volunteers to hold this line." And every single soldier stepped forward, not with calm, not with stoicism, not with the serene acceptance that a Dralith warrior would have shown. They stepped forward with shaking hands, and wet eyes, and voices that cracked, and faces that were pale with terror. And they stepped forward anyway, because that was what humans did when someone they loved needed them. And they loved each other. Kethvorin could see it now, as clearly as he could see the bioluminescent glow of the hive walls. And it was the thing that made them step forward, and the thing that made them afraid, and it was the same thing. And that was the part he had never understood until this moment. They were afraid because they loved, and they were brave because they loved, and love and fear were not opposites, but twins born from the same place in the human heart. The 20 minutes that followed were the longest of Kethvorin's 400-year life. He fought in the line beside the humans, and the elite drones came in waves, and each wave was worse than the last, and the soldiers fell one by one, and each one who fell was caught by the ones beside them and lowered gently even in the middle of combat, because humans could not stop being tender even when they were dying. Corporal Ose went down saving 2 soldiers who had been hit simultaneously, and he threw himself over them to shield them from an acid spray, and the acid burned through his armor and into his back. And he did not scream, but he looked up at Kethvorin with eyes that were calm for the first time since the alien had known him. And Osei smiled and said, "Tell my mother I was brave." And then he was gone, and Kethvorin felt something crack inside his chest, like a physical break in a structure that had stood unchanged for 400 years. Sergeant Reyes took a hit that severed his left arm at the elbow, and he looked at the stump, and looked at his rifle, and shifted it to his right hand, and kept firing. And when a drone got close enough to touch, he beat it back with the bleeding stump of his arm, and he was screaming, not in pain, but in defiance, in absolute furious refusal to die quietly. Vasquez commanded from the front line, and not from behind, and her face was a mask of blood from a wound above her eye, and her voice never wavered, even though Kethvorin could see her hands trembling between every order. 15 minutes in, and half the line was gone. 17 minutes in, and the drones were pressing so close that the fighting became hand-to-hand. 19 minutes in, and Kethvorin was standing over the bodies of fallen humans, using all 4 arms to hold back the tide. And somewhere behind him, the demolition team was shouting numbers in a countdown. 20 minutes. The charges detonated. The explosion was massive and directional, and it tore through the Queen in a blast of fire and force that shook the entire hive network. And the drones stopped moving instantly, all of them at once, as if someone had cut a string, and they collapsed where they stood. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing Kethvorin had ever heard. He stood in that silence, surrounded by the bodies of the fallen and the gasping breaths of the survivors, and he looked down at his own hands. They were shaking, all 4 of them. For the first time in 400 years of life, his hands were shaking, and he stared at them as if they belonged to someone else, and he could feel something enormous and overwhelming moving through his body like a wave that had been building for weeks and had finally broken. He was afraid. Not of the Vryn, and not of the dark, and not of dying. He was afraid of loss. He was afraid because he had watched Osei die, and he had watched soldiers fall, and he had seen the light go out of eyes that had been bright with fear and love and desperate courage. And each one of those losses had cut something inside him that he had not known could be cut. He was afraid because he had found something worth being afraid for. Vasquez sat down beside him on the floor of the ruined chamber, and she was exhausted and bleeding and alive. And she looked at his trembling hands, and a small, sad, knowing smile crossed her face. "Welcome to being alive, Kethvorin," she said. And he closed all of his eyes and let the fear wash over him, and he understood at last that it was not a weakness, and it was not a defect, of caring about something enough to lose it, and it was the most real thing he had ever felt. 7 years had passed since Calyx 9 and the harrowing was over, and the Vryn Collective had been broken and scattered across the dark edges of the galaxy, and the Coalition had declared victory, and the galaxy was trying to remember what peace felt like. Kethvorin stood in the great archive hall of the Drelith homeworld, and he looked out at the thousands of faces before him, and every single one of them was calm. Calm the way stone is calm, and the way deep water is calm, and the way the dead are calm. They were warriors and scholars and leaders and elders, and they had come from every corner of Drelith space to hear him present his memoir to the Galactic Archival Council, because word had spread that the old soldier had written something unusual, and the Drelith were curious in the way they were curious about everything, which is to say, with detached intellectual interest, and nothing more. The hall was enormous and ancient, and built from dark crystal that absorbed light and sound and emotion, and it was the perfect Drelith space because it was designed to contain knowledge without feeling. Kethvaran stood at the central platform, and he was old now, even by Drelith's standards. And his armor plating had dulled to a deep gray, and his movements were slower than they had been on Calyx 9. But his voice was strong, and his four hands were steady, for now. He began with the facts, because the Drelith respected facts above all else. He told them about his assignment to the 907th Human Expeditionary Company, and he told them about Calyx 9, and the extraction, and the assault on the Queen, and he laid out the tactical details with precision, and the council listened with their usual composed attention. And then he stopped reciting facts and started telling the truth. "I want to tell you about a young man named Ao Osai," he said, and the hall was silent, because Drelith halls were always silent. He was a medic in the 907th, the most frightened person I have ever encountered in 400 years of life. He told them about Osei's shaking hands, and the tears on his face, and the prayer he whispered before running into the open, and the way he saved 2 soldiers while every part of his body was begging him to run the other way. He told them about Osei's smile at the end, and the words he had spoken, and the way the light had left his eyes, while Kethvaran stood over him, unable to protect him with all 4 of his mighty arms. "I want to tell you about a woman named Lena Vasquez," he said, and something in his voice shifted, and the Drelith in the front rows tilted their heads, because they had never heard that particular tone from one of their own. He told them about Vasquez's daughter Sophia, and about the terror that lived inside the captain every single day, and about the night on the rooftop when she had laid her soul bare to an alien who did not yet have the capacity to understand what she was giving him. Pause. He told them that Vasquez had gone home after the war and had held her daughter again, and that Sophia was 15 now and wanted to be a doctor, and that Vasquez still woke up screaming some nights and probably always would. He told them about Sergeant Reyes, who had lost his arm in the tunnel, and who had gone home and become a teacher, and who taught children with one hand and a patience that seemed infinite, and who still flinched at loud sounds, but never let it stop him from showing up every morning. He told them about Private Chen, who had written letters every day to a brother who could not receive them because the act of writing was itself an act of love and defiance against a universe that wanted to take everything from her. He told them about soldiers who held hands at sunset, and soldiers who built memorials from rubble, and soldiers who laughed in the dark because laughter was the sound humans made when they refused to surrender to despair. The council listened, and some of them shifted in their seats, which was the Drelith equivalent of extreme discomfort, because none of this was tactical data, and none of it was strategic analysis, and none of it fit into any category they had for understanding war. One of the elder council members raised a hand, and spoke in the flat measured tone that all Drelith use, because it was the only tone they had. "Observer Kethvaran, these are interesting anthropological observations, but they do not constitute a military memoir, and the behavior you describe sounds like a species-wide vulnerability that would be better addressed through genetic modification or cognitive conditioning rather than celebrated." Kethvaran looked at the elder, and he felt something that he had first felt on Calyx 9, and that had never left him since. He felt the fear. Not the fear of the elder, or the fear of the council, or the fear of being judged, but the fear that his people would hear his words and not understand them, and that the most important truth he had ever learned would be lost, because the Drelith did not have the emotional architecture to receive it. And he pushed through that fear the way he had watched humans push through theirs. "Honored elder," he said, and his voice was quiet, and every soul in the hall leaned forward to hear. "I have a confession to make, and it is one that no Drelith has ever made in the history of our species." He paused, and the silence was absolute. "I have felt fear." The hall did not erupt, because Drelith halls do not erupt, but the stillness that followed was the loudest silence Kethvaran had ever heard, and it was louder even than the silence after the Queen had died. He continued, I felt it for the first time on Calyx 9 when I watched humans die, and I felt it because I had come to care about them. And caring about something creates the possibility of losing it, and the possibility of loss is what fear is. And I am here to tell you that it was the most profound and important experience of my 400-year life. He looked out at the thousands of calm, emotionless faces, and he spoke the words he had been carrying for 7 years. We Drelith walk into fire because we do not feel its heat, and we call this bravery. And we build statues to honor it, and we teach our children that fearlessness is the highest virtue. And we have been wrong about this for as long as our civilization has existed. His voice grew stronger, and something in it resonated through the crystal walls in a way that Drelith architecture was not designed to accommodate. What we call bravery is not bravery at all, and it is simply architecture, and it is simply the way we are built, and there is no choice in it, and there is no will in it, and there is no sacrifice in it, because sacrifice requires the possibility of loss, and we do not feel loss, and therefore we have never truly. He took a breath, and his hands trembled, and he let them tremble, and he did not hide it. The humans feel the heat, and they feel it completely and totally, and in every nerve and every neuron, and the fire is real to them in a way it has never been real to us, and they walk into it anyway. And they do this not because they are numb, and not because they are broken, and not because they do not understand the danger, but because they have found things they love more than they fear death. He thought of Osei running across open ground with tears on his face. He thought of Vasquez lying to her soldiers with her posture every morning so they could find the strength to keep going. He thought of Reyes screaming in his sleep and lacing his boots at dawn. That is not weakness, he said, and his voice filled the ancient hall. That is the most extraordinary act of will I have witnessed in 4 centuries of life, and it is something the Drelith have never been capable of, because courage is not the absence of fear, and it has never been the absence of fear. He looked at the elder who had questioned him, and he spoke the final truth. Courage is choosing to act when every part of you is screaming to stop. And we Drelith have never had to make that choice, and therefore we have never truly been brave, and we have only ever been numb. The hall was silent for a very long time. Keth Varan stood on the platform, and he felt the fear moving through him. The fear that his words had fallen on deaf ears, and the fear that nothing would change, and the fear that his people would go on believing they were the galaxy's greatest warriors, when they had never once done the thing that made a warrior great. And then something happened that had never happened in the Great Archive Hall, in all the millennia of its existence. One of the young Drelith in the back of the hall made a sound, and it was a small sound, barely audible, and it was not a word in any language Keth Varan knew, but it was the sound of something opening, and something breaking, and something being born, all at once. And then another made the same sound, and then another. The memoir was archived that day, and over the following years it became the most widely read document in Drelith history, surpassing even the Great War Chronicles and the founding texts, and it was translated into every language in the coalition. And slowly, and haltingly, and with great difficulty, the Drelith language began to change. New words appeared, words that had never existed before, words for grief, and longing, and tenderness, and vulnerability, and the ache of caring about something enough to be destroyed by its absence. And in the year following the memoir's publication, a single new word entered the Drelith lexicon, and it was voted into the official language registry by unanimous consent of the Archival Council, which had never voted unanimously on anything. The word was Kethvaros. It translated roughly as to walk forward while trembling. It was the first Drelith word for courage, and it was borrowed from humanity. Kethvaran learned of the new word on a quiet evening in his home, and he sat with the knowledge for a long time, and his old hands trembled, and he let them. And somewhere across the galaxy, on a small blue-green world, a woman named Lena Vasquez tucked her daughter into bed, and checked the locks on the doors, and lay down in the dark, and felt the fear rise in her chest, the way it always did. And she closed her eyes, and breathed through it, the way she always had. And in the morning she would rise again, because that is what humans do. They tremble, and they rise.